Red Bull and its F1 world champion Max Verstappen have launched a scathing criticism of F1's 2026 car plans. As Red Bull prepares to build its first ever F1 engine in conjunction with Ford, the team has called for urgent action to be taken before the rules for the championship's next generation car are finalised. But is the stance taken by the likes of Verstappen and Christian Horner really born from an altruistic concern about F1's future spectacle, or is arch-rival Mercedes right to question whether Red Bull has a hidden agenda? F1's 2026 engine regulations were signed off in August last year, committing F1 to a split combustion and electrical power output ratio of 50% each, dropping the complex MGUH and uprating the MGUK. The chassis rules are still being defined, although broadly the intention is to make the cars lighter if possible, introduce active aerodynamics so wing levels can change through corners and on straights, and potentially eliminate the drag reduction system. The engine rules package has tempted Audi into committing to an F1 works team for the first time, while Ford is partnering with Red Bull and Honda has decided to start a new project with Aston Martin. Whenever any of these programs have been announced, the importance of sustainability has been stressed, as has the significance of these specific F1 engine rules and the ability to use relevant technology to further the development of and then market their respective electric vehicles. Last week though, Red Bull Racing boss Christian Horner made public a concern about the consequences of a 50-50 split in power between electric and internal combustion and how the chassis rules are progressing. We'll get to the specifics of his complaints and a rant that Max Verstappen went on in Austria as well in a moment. What Red Bull wants is a reduction in the electrical power output of the 2026 engine, with Horner arguing a 5 or 10% swing in the electric combustion ratio could have a significant effect. He believes that using sustainable fuels means F1 can lean more on the V6 while still pushing the right message. He's advocating all this despite what was already agreed long ago, and the fact it is what tempted so many manufacturers in for 2026, including Red Bull's partner Ford. Horner argues that the regulations are already a hybrid of what was originally intended, and that it's natural to work through a new set of rules in more detail and identify where things need to be tweaked or improved. He suggested the FIA is conducting its own due diligence on the matter, and that certain teams share very similar opinions to that of our own. But it's also understood that Horner has been pushing this message in private in F1 commission meetings up until now, and that some of Red Bull's rivals feel he's banging the drums solo. Our sources have indicated it's desperately unlikely F1 and the FIA will ratify a fundamental change to the engine rules, like reducing the electrical power output. Sauber's official F1 representative, Alessandro Aluni Bravi, politely shot down Horner's suggestion on behalf of Audi, which is taking over Sauber for 2026, and Mercedes boss Toto Wolff, who is obviously no fan of Horner given his team's toxic rivalry with Red Bull at times, said there is zero chance F1 could change the rules now that the manufacturers have signed up. Wolff doesn't deny that the 2026 rules pose a challenge, but we'll get to that shortly. Let's cover what Red Bull is specifically unhappy with and wants F1 and the FIA to take urgent action over. Horner claims F1 risks creating a Frankenstein's monster of a car that asks too much of the chassis to compensate for problems he believes the planned internal combustion and electric power ratio will cause. He's raised concerns over a colossal battery size and cooling requirements adding weight, and believes the need for complex active aero to offset the weight and drag levels of a bulky car will wreck racing because it will be impossible to slipstream. Horner warned the combustion engine risks becoming a generator to recharge a battery, although we're not really sure what that's meant to mean, and he even suggested it could result in drivers downshifting on straights to regenerate batteries. Red Bull star driver Verstappen echoed several of Horner's specific grievances after winning the Austrian Grand Prix. He said conversations with the team, the data and Red Bull simulations indicate that it looks pretty terrible, and that at Monza, one of F1's most power sensitive tracks, downshifting while at full speed 400 or 500 metres before the end of the straight is required because it's faster. Verstappen said F1 needs to seriously look at this before it's too late, and his position understandably has more of an element of driver worried he could be stitched up by the planned rules. It's clear Verstappen is worried that the engines will become a dominant factor again, having already lived through the Mercedes domination for so many years of the V6 turbo hybrid era. Verstappen shared his boss's view that overtaking will become trickier, but raised a specific concern of his own relating to active aero. Verstappen says he's worried that if the systems of having more wing in the corners and less on the straights are automated, it will take less control from the driver and potentially stop them from getting exactly what they need and when. Essentially, Verstappen is advocating simpler, lighter cars and a formula that isn't so dependent on an engine war. That's no surprise given he's no fan of the current heavy cars already, and his Red Bull team has only recently been able to thrive in this engine rules cycle. One obvious inference of Red Bull's stance is that the first Red Bull F1 engine isn't progressing very well. Wolff even went as far as suggesting the remarks are because Horner is frightened that Red Bull's engine won't be competitive. Red Bull set up a new engine division to build its own F1 power unit for the first time, with Ford drafted in as a partner, although some have questioned whether it's more of a commercial deal than a true technical alliance. Ford is meant to be providing more assistance on the energy recovery side, given Red Bull Powertrains was set up mainly with a greater focus on the combustion engine, although it was always the intention to be able to tool up the facility to produce the energy recovery system in-house if needed. Wolff said that you always have to question what is the real motivation behind comments like Horner's, with the implication being that if Red Bull wants the engine rules to change for 2026, then there's something it's struggling with. It's no surprise that Mercedes just thinks Red Bull's trying to do something to help itself, and equally unsurprising is that Horner has defended his position, claiming that Wolff is just focused on his team, whereas, my interest is actually about the sport rather than self-gain. Horner says F1 stakeholders have all failed if they don't ensure that the 2026 package is as good as it can be, but there doesn't seem to be widespread concern on Red Bull's level. It's been downplayed by some senior figures, even though they believe it does reflect a part of the 2026 rules that is a genuine issue, which is that the engine and chassis regulations have been created too independently and need to be developed now more closely. Wolff's acknowledged it will be difficult to finalise the right chassis rules and manage the battery over a full lap. He admits it's true that if a 2026 engine was put on today's chassis, then on tracks with very long straights there would be massive derates, which is when the engine runs out of electrical power to deploy and the car begins to slow down. But as Wolff put it, such a car would be heavy like a prototype and big like an elephant. In other words, as the chassis regulations are refined and development intensifies, the outlook for 2026 will improve significantly. Wolff was clearly amused by the concern Horner raised about drivers having to downshift on straights in particular and likened it to doom-mongering. When the specific remarks about downshifting on straights were put to him, Wolff replied by asking if people really think that F1's not innovative enough to come up with a way to avoid such a scenario. The chassis rules aren't set in stone, so there is still room for refinement, and beyond that, teams and manufacturers have more than 2 years to improve their products. But if Red Bull really does need the rules to change in a more fundamental way, their scathing rants aren't going to cut it alone. What do you think? Is Red Bull just highlighting some legitimate concerns about F1's future direction, and is it something that championship stakeholders should take seriously? Or are you on Mercedes' side, and this is just a veil that Red Bull is trying to hide problems with its 2026 engine behind? Let us know in the comments, and if you want to brush up on how Red Bull's 2026 engine project is going to work, check out this video about the powertrain's plan and Ford's F1 comeback.